Family gatherings are supposed to feel warm, familiar faces, shared history, belonging. So why do some people avoid them entirely? Not out of hatred, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system remembers something their mind tries to forget. The tension in old rooms, the roles that snap back into place, the version of yourself you worked hard to outgrow. For some, staying away isn't social avoidance, it's emotional self-protection. A quiet choice to preserve peace, stability, and identity in a space that once demanded silence, adaptation, or survival. For some people, the idea of a family gathering doesn't register as comfort or celebration. It registers as stimulation. Noise, overlapping conversations, emotional undercurrents, subtle expectations, unresolved history, all happening at once. The nervous system doesn't experience this as neutral social activity, experiences it as load. Psychologically, sensitive or highly adaptive nervous systems tend to scan environments continuously. They track tone shifts, microtensions, unspoken dynamics, who might need managing, who might erupt, who might withdraw. Even when nothing goes wrong, the body stays alert because it has learned that familiar spaces can change quickly. What looks like relaxation to others can feel like quiet vigilance to someone whose system was trained in complexity rather than safety. Over time, this creates fatigue that doesn't always feel dramatic. Feels like heaviness before the event, mental resistance, a vague sense of depletion afterward. The person may not consciously associate this exhaustion with trauma or stress. They just know that gatherings cost more energy than they seem to give back. Avoidance becomes a form of regulation, not avoidance of people, but avoidance of overload. There's also a philosophical dimension here. Modern culture often celebrates endurance as maturity, the ability to tolerate discomfort without complaint. But nervous systems don't respond to moral narratives. They respond to accumulated experience. When stimulation consistently exceeds capacity, withdrawal becomes wisdom, not weakness. This doesn't mean the person dislikes their family or lacks connection. It means their system prioritizes stability over performance. Peace becomes more valuable than participation. Sometimes staying away isn't about distance from people. It's about proximity to your own nervous system. Limits. Family spaces don't just contain people, they contain memory. Every room carries emotional residue from earlier versions of yourself. Earlier conflicts, earlier roles you were assigned long before you had the power to choose them. When someone walks back into that environment, the nervous system doesn't respond to the present moment alone. It responds to everything that has ever happened there. Psychologically, this is called state-dependent memory. Certain places, smells, tones of voice, or seating arrangements can activate old emotional circuits automatically. A person may intellectually know they've grown, healed, or changed, yet their body begins reenacting patterns that once kept them safe. The confident adult suddenly feels smaller. The independent thinker becomes cautious. Calm person becomes hyper-aware. None of this is conscious choice. It's conditioned response. What makes family gatherings uniquely complex is that the history is often unspoken. Old tensions may never have been resolved, only buried under politeness. Expectations remain invisible, but active. Who you're supposed to be, how much space you're allowed to take, what topics are safe. These rules resurface silently the moment you enter the room. Even when nothing explicit happens, the emotional atmosphere carries a familiar pressure. Philosophically, this raises an uncomfortable truth. Identity is partially shaped by context. We don't exist in isolation. Environments pull versions of us forward, sometimes versions we no longer want to inhabit. Avoidance in this case isn't fear of people. It's resistance to regression. For some, staying away is the only way to protect the self they've worked hard to build. Growth requires environments that recognize change, not ones that unconsciously demand the past. Sometimes the room remembers you even when you've outgrown it, as people grow emotionally. They begin to recognize something subtle but powerful. Not every environment supports the person they are becoming. Certain spaces invite old behaviors, old compromises, old versions of the self that no longer fit. For many, avoiding family gatherings isn't rejection, it's boundary maintenance at a nervous system level.
Psychologically, boundaries aren't just verbal rules.
They're internal limits that protect emotional stability, identity, and self-respect. When those limits are repeatedly challenged or ignored in familiar environments, the mind learns that presence requires self-negotiation. You start editing your thoughts, softening your reactions, shrinking your preferences to preserve harmony. Over time, this quiet self-adjustment becomes exhausting. Avoidance becomes a way to preserve coherence. Instead of constantly switching between who you are and who you're expected to be, you choose spaces where alignment is easier. This isn't about control. It's about conserving psychological integrity. When a person finally experiences environments where their nervous system doesn't have to brace or perform, returning to emotionally demanding settings can feel unnecessary rather than brave. There's also a philosophical shift embedded here. Maturity isn't endless tolerance, it's discernment, ability to choose where your energy goes, what patterns you reinforce, and which dynamics you allow to shape your identity. Protecting growth sometimes requires distance from systems that cannot adapt at the same pace. This can look selfish from the outside, but internally it's often an act of self-stability. A person isn't running from connection, they're choosing consistency over chaos. Boundaries aren't walls meant to isolate, they're structures that keep the self intact. There's another layer that often goes unnoticed: the exhaustion of performance. Family gatherings rarely allow people to arrive as they actually are. Instead, they invite a familiar version of the self, polite, agreeable, emotionally filtered, strategically neutral. For someone who has spent years learning how to regulate other people's comfort, this performance activates automatically. Psychologically, masking requires constant micro-adjustments. Tone is softened, opinions are edited. Emotional reactions are measured before they're expressed. Even silence becomes strategic. None of this feels dramatic in the moment, but it consumes cognitive and emotional energy continuously. The body stays engaged, alert, subtly managing perception rather than simply existing. Over time, the nervous system begins associating these environments with depletion rather than connection. It's not that the person dislikes their family, it's that the version of themselves required in that space feels restrictive, incomplete, and effortful. Authenticity becomes fragmented into acceptable pieces while the rest is quietly held back. Philosophically, this touches something deeper about identity and dignity. Human beings don't only need safety, they need congruence, the ability to inhabit themselves without constant correction. When environments consistently reward performance over presence, the psyche adapts by limiting exposure rather than endlessly accommodating distortion. Avoidance, in this sense, isn't antisocial behavior. It's a recalibration of energy. A decision to invest attention where it can exist naturally instead of strategically, where silence doesn't feel loaded, where expression doesn't require negotiation. When being yourself costs more energy than it gives back, distance becomes a form of self-respect. One of the quiet fears beneath avoidance is the fear of becoming someone you've already worked to outgrow. Familiar environments have a powerful way of pulling old patterns back to the surface. The nervous system remembers how it once survived in that space, and it often defaults to those strategies automatically, even when they no longer reflect who you are. Psychologically, this is a form of behavioral memory. Certain tones, dynamics, or relational roles activate earlier versions of the self without conscious intent. The confident adult may suddenly become overly accommodating. The emotionally regulated person may feel reactive or small. The independent thinker may find themselves seeking approval again. None of this means growth was fake. It means conditioning runs deeper than intention. For many people, returning to family gatherings doesn't just bring discomfort, it brings a subtle identity threat. It challenges the stability they've built elsewhere. After spending time in environments that support authenticity, being pulled back into outdated roles can feel disorienting, even discouraging. It's not nostalgia, it's regression pressure. Philosophically, this highlights how identity is maintained through repetition and context. Who you become is reinforced by the spaces you inhabit. When those spaces consistently invite an earlier self, staying away becomes a way of protecting continuity. Growth isn't only about change, it's about protecting the changes that have already occurred. Avoidance here isn't fear of family, it's respect for momentum. A recognition that certain environments still speak to older wiring. Even when the conscious mind has moved forward, Sometimes staying away isn't resistance. It's loyalty to the person you've finally become. Even when someone avoids family gatherings for grounded psychological reasons, the emotional story is rarely clean or simple. Absence often carries its own quiet grief. Not the dramatic kind, but a soft, lingering sadness for moments that could have been different. For connections that never fully formed, for versions of closeness that existed more in imagination than in reality. Psychologically, humans are wired for belonging, especially in familiar systems. Choosing distance doesn't erase that wiring. A person can understand why separation protects their stability and still feel the ache of disconnection. Relief and longing often coexist in the same emotional space. Peace can arrive alongside subtle loss. This emotional duality is difficult to explain to others because it contradicts the idea that avoidance equals indifference. There's also the social layer. Family gatherings are culturally framed as proof of normalcy, loyalty, and health. When someone opts out, they may feel quietly out of sync with social expectations, even if no one openly criticizes them. Conversations become harder to navigate. Questions arise. Explanations feel inadequate. Over time, many learn to carry this complexity privately, rather than repeatedly justify a deeply personal choice. Philosophically, this exposes how much society simplifies human connection. We prefer clear narratives. Closeness equals love. Distance equals conflict. But real psychological boundaries live in nuance. Sometimes distance is chosen not to punish, but to preserve what little connection can exist without harm. Avoidance doesn't mean the bond vanished. It often means the bond had to change shape in order to survive. Not every absence is rejection. Some are acts of quiet emotional honesty.